We're almost done building the first section of our page. But what's missing is this cool animated button that I showed you right at the beginning. So let's go build that. And by coding up this button, you will learn techniques that are going to be useful in countless situations in the future. So you're going to learn what pseudo elements and pseudo classes are and why they are important, how and why to use the after pseudo element, and how to build a creative hover animation effect using the transition property. So this lecture is probably going to be rather long, but I promise you it's going to be totally worth it. So the button that I'm talking about is this one here. And so it has this nice effect, you see, where it looks like it's getting bigger and then in the end it fades out, so after like half a second or something, you see? So this is what we're going to build. So it moves up a little bit and creates this shadow beneath it. And so it looks like it's moving up in direction to the user. So let's check it again. So it's like it's really moving up. And that's why the shadow then appears. Now look what happens when we click it. So it goes down a little bit and the shadow also disappears a little bit, as if we were really pushing it towards the page. Want to see it again? So we hover it, it elevates, and then as we click it, it looks like it's going back down. And you can see it because it moves down and because the shadow gets a little bit smaller. So you see? There it is. Then it actually moves down, but let's see it again. And there it is. Right? So let's first code up that part where this functionality happens, and then later we're going to care about this white part that looks like it's like flying out or something. It's growing bigger and bigger and then disappears. So back to our markup here. Remember that I was saying that we were going to add something here to this text box. And what I mean is, of course, this button. So the button will be an anchor element, so A, for now with an href of nothing, so leading to nothing, which is this hash symbol. And then of course we need to give it some class. And I'm going to call it as usual button, but at the same time I'm giving it another class calling button white. Because we're going to have multiple buttons on a page, some will be white and some will be green, but most of the functionality is the same, only the color changes. And so I'm going to put the styles about the color here in this class, and the stuff that doesn't change from the white to the green button in this button class. So we've done this before, at least in my other HTML course, and so this should be nothing new to you. It's just a good practice. Alright, and the text which we have on this link, on this button, is discover our tours. Just like this. And so let's now start styling the button element down here. So you see our CSS file is getting rather long. We're already at 121 lines here, but don't worry, we're gonna think about architecture and all that stuff a bit later. So for now in this section we're just focusing on getting this code ready here and getting this header element ready. And we're gonna think about organizational aspects of our code a bit later. So with this we select the button element, but since it's a link, I'm sure you already know that we should do it like this. Alright, and what is this? So this here is a pseudo class. It's the link pseudo class. And pseudo classes are a special state of a selector. So this link here is the state of the button selector. So like when a user hovers an element, or when the checkbox is clicked, or if we want to select a last child, and many other possibilities. So we use pseudo classes to style elements under a special condition. And it's a very important concept that we're going to use all the time. So the link is a special state of a selector when it is an anchor element. So it functions as a link. Now there's also the visited state. So button visited. So this is the state when the user has already clicked on the button once before and then sees the button again. So that's the visited state. And I'm sure that you know that, for example, if we don't style a link at all, it will appear blue in the beginning, and then once we click on it once, when we see it again, then it will be purple. So that's the default styling of links in most of the browsers. Now we don't want this, we want the visited state to look exactly like the link state, so the normal state of our links. And so we just put them together. Now the first thing we're going to do is to say that we want the text to be uppercase, text transform uppercase. We want there to be no text decoration. Let's actually take a look so we can see what exactly we want to change. So here we go. So we don't want, of course, this color, and we don't want this underline. So let's get rid of it. So text decoration, and I'm sure you already know all of these. That's why these properties that are not really new to you, I'm not really explaining what they're doing, okay? So none, and then the text we want to be gray. Now remember that we're going to have multiple colors for the button. And so in the white button, the text will be this dark gray, but in the green button, it will probably be white. And so that's something that we have to do in this external class. So let me already create that actually. So it's called button white. And so here we're going to have a background color of white, of course, background color. And you saw I did this trick where I just write a couple of letters and then the text editor figures out which property I want. And this way I have to type less code. So white, as we saw already, FFF, and the color should be 777, as we already used before. Now we also want some padding around the button, of course. So let's specify that as well. And once again, I'm sure you're already familiar with how the shorten property of padding works. So we can specify only one value and then it will apply everywhere, so top, bottom, left and right. Or we can also write two values. Then the first one will be for top and bottom and the second one will be for left and right. So let's say 15 pixels and 40 pixels. So now we have a padding at the top and at the bottom of 15 pixels and left and right 40 pixels. And we could also write four numbers. Then the first one would be top, the second would be right, the third one would be the bottom, and the fourth one would be for the left side. Okay, now check this out, but I will tell you already that it's not going to work as expected because it's occupying here this space on the top of this other text where it shouldn't. And that's because it's right now an inline element. So this button here is right now an inline element because it's simply text, but we should display it as an inline block. In this way, the box model works on this element as if it was just a normal block element, okay? So we should always do this if we want to give some paddings or some heights or width to elements, okay? Now another thing that I noticed here, let me just refresh this. So now it has its own space. Another thing that we want is this actually to be here in the middle of this box, right? So how could we do that? How could we achieve this button to be in the center of the box? Do you think we should use absolute positioning or transforms like we did before? Well, I don't think so, because that would really be overkill. It would be way too much for this very simple problem. So this is an inline block element, and so it's treated as if it was text. And so if it's text and we want it to be at the center of this box, all we have to do is to set the text box, I believe it's called, exactly, it's text box. All we have to do is to set its text align property to center. And that's it. So now it's going to center the text that is inside of the box, including, of course, the button. So just to be sure, yeah, here it goes. And since we're here, let's also add here some white space between this heading element and the button. So how do we do white space? Exactly, we use the margin property. And in this case, we just want margin at the bottom. So we say margin bottom, and let's say we want 60 pixels. All right, I'm not going to check it right now. We're going to check it later on. So this is the link and the visited state. Now let's take care actually of the hover state. So button hover. So another pseudo class to select a different and special state of this element. So what do we want to happen? Remember, the first thing is for this element to move up. So how can we do that? We use transform, such as we did before. So you see, transform is something really, really important. It's an extremely important property that we're using all the time to create cool and modern effects where elements move around or even rotate or stuff. So transform is really important. So now we want to translate it and we want it to move up. So which direction is that? X or Y? And it's right, it's direction Y, of course. And we want it to move up. So we use a negative value. And that's because in CSS, the epsilon axis moves from the top to the bottom. So it's like from the top to the bottom. And if we want to move up, we have to go the other way around. And so it's negative. So to go up, it's a negative value. So negative -3 pixels in this case. So that's for the hover. Now when we clicked it, remember it looked a bit different. So it's the active state. Remember, when we click an element, then that's called the active state. So it's the active pseudo class. So remember what it looked like when we clicked it? Again, it's a translate because again it moved. And this time we're only moving it 1 pixel up. So this 1 pixel up, so this -1 pixel is in relation to the initial state, so the link state, not to the hover. So it's not -1 pixel in relation to the hover state, but it's always here related to the initial link state, okay? So let's check that out. So the margin is there and we hover, so it goes up. No animation so far, but it goes up. And when we click, it goes down a bit, right? So cool. Now all we have to do is to animate this and then also add these shadows. But first let's actually add the rounded corners. So border radius. And here we can put a really high number, like let's say even 100 pixels or something. And then what it will do is to simply shape it like this here on the edges. So if you put 200 or 500 pixels, it will all still be the same, okay? So now all we have to do is this small animation. And so remember that in the last lecture I said that there are 2 types of animations. The first one is to simply use the transition property, which is the easier one, and the more complex one is the method that we used, which was to really specify the steps of the animations with the keyframes add rule. Now in this case that's not necessary at all. All we have to do is to use the transition property, transition. And now we have to just specify which properties we want to animate. And if we're not really sure, or if we don't want to write them out, we can simply say all. So in this case, all the properties are enabled to be animated. Then we can also specify a time that we want. Let's say we want 0.2 seconds. So this is already the shorthand version of the transition. So just like before here where we had a shorthand for animation, instead of writing out all of these properties, we do the same with transition. We just write all of these possibilities here in the same property as a shorthand because it's just easier. And so now the transform on the hover as well as on the active will be animated in relation to their initial state. And this is actually causes sometimes a lot of confusion as to why the transition property has to be on the initial state. But that's just how it works. So on the initial state, we say that there can be a transition basically on all the properties. And then on the hover, so here we say how it should look like in the hover state and in the active state. And then the animation is going to happen. So let's take a look at that. And yeah, here we go. So now it moves up and very nicely it moves down. Just like this. Okay. Now all we have to do is to add the box shadow, and it's also when we do the hover. So box shadow. And so in the box shadow property, we can specify a bunch of values. So the first one is the offset in the X direction. And since we don't want any shadow in the X direction, we only want it in the epsilon direction, we put a 0 here. Now in epsilon, which is the second one, we actually want some offset. So 10 pixels, let's say. So the shadow will be 10 pixels down. Then the third value is the blur that we want to see. And let's say 20 pixels, so we have a really high blur here. And this makes for a more blurry shadow, so it looks like we're further away. And so in the active part here, in the active box shadow, we're then going to reduce that blur, and then it looks like we're back closer to the page, okay? And here now finally we can put a color, so an RGBA in this case, because we want the color of the shadow to be transparent. So here we put it to black, complete black, and then let's just put a transparency value. So this is black, but not completely black, but only with a 20% opacity, in order to make it just a very subtle shadow and not all too visible. We want it to be really subtle, okay? Now you can play around then with different numbers to see how it's going to look like if you make it darker, if you make it less opaque. 20% I think is a good way to go. Now remember when we click on a button, so when it's active, we want the shadow to look smaller, and so to give the impression that the button is closer to the page and so further away from the user. So let's decrease this here to 5, and then we also want it less blurred. So let's say 10 pixels here, okay? So I'm doing this from my experience because I have a lot of experience by playing around with these values. So if this looks a bit like magic to you, then don't worry, it comes with practice. And so again, you should just play around with these numbers and take a look how things behave if you change the values, okay? Now let's just take a look. And yeah, so you see the shadow coming up, right? And now when we click it, it goes down like this. So we lose a bit of shadow and it also becomes less blurry. Just to show you how it would look like with 1 pixel, for example, let's see. So you see there's a lot less blur now, right? But we want a little bit of blur to make it look more natural. And so let's put that 10 pixel that we had before. Okay, and with that we have the first part of the button ready. Now to build the second part of this button, which includes some more animation effects, just join me right in the next lecture.